Let me paint you a picture. It's 6 in the morning. November. I'm standing in the middle of a 42,000 square foot warehouse that smells like rust, rot, and 30 years of saltwater damage. 3 of the 20 overhead lights actually work. The floor is a patchwork of cracked concrete and standing puddles. There's a section of the north wall where you can see actual daylight coming through, not from a window, from where the corrugated steel panels have separated from the frame. This is my inheritance. My name is Sam. And according to my family, I was always the one who never quite figured it out. My brother Derek got the Callaway Group's flagship property, a 180,000 square foot modern logistics center on the north end of the port. Automated loading systems. Climate-controlled storage. 16 semi-truck docks. Appraised at between $9 and $11 million depending on who you ask. I got Warehouse 7. Built in 1951. Condemned by the city twice and somehow still standing. The family lawyer, a man named Gerald Fitch who had the energy of someone who had been mildly disappointed his entire adult life, told me to consider the demolition value. Said I could probably clear $60,000 if I found the right buyer for the scrap. $60,000. While Derek walked into $11 million. Now, I want to be clear about something before we get into what actually happened. This isn't just a story about money. It's a story about what my family had been hiding for 30 years inside a building they were so sure I'd never bother to actually look at. They miscalculated. Stay with me. I need to give you some context on the Callaway family, because without it, none of what comes later makes sense. My grandfather, Harold Callaway, built the original shipping and warehousing business from nothing in the late 1940s. First-generation money. The man started with one flatbed truck, a handshake reputation for reliable delivery along the eastern seaboard, and a mechanical mind that was, and I say this having done a lot of research into who he actually was, genuinely extraordinary. Harold wasn't just a logistics guy. He was an inventor. A problem solver. He held patents. Real ones. Filed through proper legal channels with the USPTO, covering proprietary loading equipment designs, specialized cargo containment systems, and at least 2 innovations in refrigerated maritime transport that were considered cutting edge for their era. But Harold died in 1987. And when he died, my father Richard and my uncle Pete took over the business. And what those 2 men were very good at, much better than they were at innovation, was spending money and rewriting history. By the time I was old enough to understand family dynamics, Harold Callaway had been reduced to a footnote. Dad would mention him occasionally as the founder, the way a corporation mentions its origins on a website. Respectful, distant, and carefully vague. Anytime I asked specific questions, what did Grandpa Harold actually invent, what happened to his workshop, why did the original warehouse close, I got redirected. Changed subjects. Once, when I was maybe 16 and pushed a little too hard, my father looked at me with this particular expression he had, somewhere between irritated and cautious, and said, "That's old business, Sam. Ancient history. Focus on the present." I learned to stop asking. Fast forward to 3 months ago. My parents, Richard and Carol Callaway, both in their late 60s and restructuring their estate, their words, decided to divide the primary business assets between Derek and me. They sat us both down in the living room of their house and presented it like a gift. Derek got the new logistics center. I got Warehouse 7. Derek had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. He's not a bad person, my brother. He's just always been better at accepting things as they are. I asked, point blank, why the split was so uneven. My mother said, gently, the way she says everything, Derek has always been more focused on the business side, Sam. You've always been more creative. We thought you might appreciate having something with more flexibility. Something you could do something different with. Flexibility. That was the word she used. What she meant was, we don't think you'll do anything serious with it, and $60,000 in demolition value is more than enough for someone with your track record. My track record, for the record, includes a failed restaurant venture in my late 20s, 2 years of freelance consulting work that paid inconsistently, and one very expensive divorce. None of which I'm proud of. All of which my family treated as permanent evidence of a permanent character flaw. So I took the warehouse. I signed the transfer documents Gerald Fitch put in front of me. I shook my father's hand. And I drove out to Warehouse 7 for the first time in probably 15 years. And I decided that before I called the demolition company, I was going to actually walk every square foot of what I'd been given. I want to be honest with you about the first few days. Warehouse 7 is rough. I mean structurally, cosmetically, and atmospherically rough. The building sits at the edge of what used to be a working shipyard district, the kind of neighborhood that had 3 functioning bars and a union hall in 1965 and now has a vape shop, a storage unit facility, and a lot of chain-link fence. The surrounding blocks have that particular post-industrial texture where half the buildings are derelict and half have been converted into breweries and CrossFit gyms, and somehow both halves feel equally strange. The warehouse itself is a steel frame structure with a brick lower half and corrugated metal upper panels, some of which are original 1951 construction and some of which were replaced at various points over the decades, badly and inconsistently. The roof has at least 4 active leak points. The electrical system is a nightmare. I had an electrician named Tony come out on day 2, and he spent 45 minutes walking the panel boxes before he turned to me and said, quietly, "You know this place should have burned down about 6 times, right?" Tony patched what he could and told me to keep a fire extinguisher in every quadrant, which I did. The interior is divided into 3 main bays and a small office block on the southeast corner. The bays had been used for general storage at various points after the original business operations moved to the new facility, and what that means practically is that there is a lot of junk. Old pallets. Rusted shelving units. Cardboard boxes that had absorbed enough moisture to basically become mulch. Industrial equipment I couldn't immediately identify. Furniture that had no business being in a warehouse. Someone at some point had stored a complete set of 1970s office furniture in Bay 2, still wrapped in moving blankets that had fused to the fabric from decades of humidity. I started clearing systematically. I rented a dumpster, then a second one. I hired 2-day laborers named Marco and Phil who showed up every morning at 7 and worked without complaint and were genuinely the most efficient human beings I encountered during this entire process. We moved from the northeast corner of Bay 1 and worked our way across. On day 4, in the southwest corner of Bay 3, the darkest, dampest corner of the building, stacked behind what turned out to be 3 disassembled conveyor sections and about 40 years of general accumulation, Marco called out to me. "Hey Sam. You should come look at this." Behind the conveyors, behind 2 collapsed metal shelving units, behind what I can only describe as a deliberate arrangement of large, heavy objects that appeared to have been positioned rather than simply stored, there was a wall. Or what looked like a wall. But when Marco cleared the last of the shelving away and I got a flashlight on it, I could see the seam. The outline. A steel door, set flush into a poured concrete surround that was clearly not original to the building's construction. This was an addition. A deliberate, engineered addition. The door was maybe 4 feet wide, 6 feet tall, solid plate steel with no visible hinges, they were on the interior, and a locking mechanism I didn't recognize at first. 3-point deadbolt system, the kind used on commercial vaults, with a combination dial and a separate key cylinder. The door also had something else. Running along the bottom, barely visible under the grime, was a thin black rubber gasket. The kind used for climate sealing. This door was not just secure. It was insulated. Something on the other side was being maintained at a controlled temperature. In an abandoned warehouse with no active utilities. I stood there for a long moment. Phil said, from behind me, "You want us to keep clearing?" I said, "Take the rest of the day off. I'll Venmo you for the full day." And then I stood in front of that door for a very long time. Before I tell you what was behind that door, and I promise you, I'm going to tell you everything, I need to ask you something directly. Because what I found didn't just change my financial situation. It exposed something my parents had done 30 years ago that was, depending on how you look at it, either deeply unethical or outright criminal. And the moment I understood what I was looking at, I had a choice to make. If you found the secret your parents had been lying about for 30 years, would you give it back to protect their reputation? Or would you use it to secure your own future? Subscribe if you're choosing yourself. Hit the notification bell. Because this story is about to get a lot more complicated. Getting that door open took 11 days. I want to walk you through that process because I think it matters to understanding who I became during those 11 days. I went in as someone who half expected to find old machine parts or maybe some forgotten inventory. I came out of those 11 days as someone who had started to understand, for the first time, what my grandfather actually was. First, the practical problem. I needed to open a 3-point vault-style deadbolt without the combination and without the key, on a door I legally owned, in a building I legally owned, without destroying whatever was on the other side. I called 4 locksmiths. 3 of them took one look at the lock mechanism and declined. The 4th, a woman named Renata who ran a commercial locksmith and security business out of a van and clearly found the whole situation interesting, spent 2 visits studying the lock before she told me, this is a Sargent and Greenleaf 8077 series. Modified. Somebody added the key cylinder as a secondary system, that's not original to the lock design. The combination dial is your primary. The key cylinder was added later, probably as a backup. She told me that without the combination, she could attempt a manipulation, a tactile, mechanical process of feeling the lock's internal components to find the correct combination, but it would take time. Multiple sessions. She charged me $200 a session. 4 sessions. $800. On day 11 of those sessions, I was sitting in a camp chair 6 feet away, drinking gas station coffee, when I heard 3 distinct clicks and Renata said, "There you go." The door swung inward on pneumatic hinges, expensive, well-maintained, with a sound like a sigh. And when it opened, a subtle change in air pressure washed over me. Cool, dry air. Even, controlled. Maybe 65 degrees Fahrenheit with low humidity. Renata looked into the darkness beyond the door and said, "I'm going to wait out here." I can't blame her. I went in with a flashlight. The stairs were steel, open grate, descending maybe 12 feet below grade. The basement was roughly 2,000 square feet, a significant construction project, completely invisible from the exterior, excavated and built at some point after the original warehouse went up. The walls were poured concrete, sealed. The ceiling had exposed mechanical systems, a still functional HVAC unit connected to an independent electrical feed that I later determined was tied to a buried line off the main grid. The billing account, I found out later, was still active under Harold Calloway's name, paid by automatic bank draft from an account that had been set up in 1991 and apparently never touched. The bill was approximately $140 a month. It had been paid, automatically, for 30-plus years, by a dead man's bank account that nobody had bothered to close. That detail alone will tell you something about how invisible this place was. The basement had custom steel shelving units along 3 walls, floor to ceiling. Every shelf was organized. Labeled. Each section was separated by archival quality materials, acid-free boxes, polyester film sleeves, custom fabricated wooden cradles for larger items. Whoever built this storage system knew exactly what they were doing. The 4th wall, the wall directly opposite the stairs, had a large wooden workbench along its full length. And on the workbench, under a fitted dust cover made of the kind of anti-static material you see in electronics manufacturing, there were objects. Machines. Prototypes. I pulled the dust cover off slowly. I was looking at 3 mechanical devices, each roughly the size of a large microwave, each constructed with a level of precision that made it immediately clear these were not commercial products. These were handmade. Prototype-level engineering. Each one was tagged with a small metal plate, engraved, with a number and a date. The dates ranged from 1971 to 1983. And then I started opening the archival boxes on the shelves. And that's when I understood what I was actually looking at. Harold Callaway filed 17 patents between 1965 and 1985. I knew about 0 of them before I walked into that basement. The USPTO patent database is public. I know that now. I've spent the last 3 months learning more about intellectual property law than I ever expected to. But at the moment I started pulling documents from those archival boxes, all I knew was that I was looking at original patent application documents, physical, stamped, signed originals, for a series of mechanical innovations related to cargo handling and refrigerated maritime transport. Let me be specific, because specific is what matters here. 3 of Harold's patents covered innovations in refrigerated cargo containment systems for maritime shipping, specific mechanical solutions for maintaining temperature stability in shipborne containers during ocean transit. When those patents were filed, in the late 1960s and early 1970s, refrigerated maritime shipping was a rapidly growing industry. The systems Harold designed were, from what I've come to understand, genuinely elegant solutions to real engineering problems. Those patents expired decades ago. Patent protection in the U.S. runs 20 years from the filing date, so Harold's earliest patents would have expired by the late 1980s. But here's what doesn't expire: physical documentation, provenance, and in certain circumstances, which I'll get to, the documented history of who invented what, and when. There were also 5 patents that Harold had filed but that, according to the records in those boxes, had been abandoned mid-process. The applications were there. The documentation supporting them was there. The reason for abandonment, clipped to 2 of the files with original paper clips, was a single typed note each time, withdrawn per R.C. R.C. Richard Callaway. My father. Harold died in 1987. 2 of those patent applications were withdrawn in 1988 and 1989, after Harold's death, by my father, who had power of attorney over Harold's estate. Why would you withdraw a patent application? You might do it if the cost of maintaining the application outweighed the expected return. You might do it if the technology had been superseded. Or you might do it if, for reasons of your own, you didn't want those patents to exist. I needed help understanding what I was looking at. I called a woman I'd worked with briefly during my consulting years, a patent attorney named Dr. Vivian Marsh, based in D.C., and I described what I'd found without sending any images yet. She told me to photograph everything, maintain chain of custody, don't move anything until I had a full documented inventory, and come see her in person. I did all of that. I spent 4 days photographing every document, every object, every label. I built a full inventory spreadsheet. Marco and Phil helped me with the physical logistics, removing nothing, just cataloging. Then I drove to D.C. Dr. Marsh spent 6 hours with me, reviewing photographs and then reviewing my own certified copies of the documents I'd had made by a notary. She was quiet for most of it. The kind of quiet that tells you a person is working hard. At the end of 6 hours, she sat back and told me 3 things. First, the original patent documents were historically significant, potentially quite valuable to collectors and to institutional archives, but not commercially actionable given the expiration dates. Second, the prototype machines were a different matter entirely. 2 of them corresponded to the abandoned patent applications. Functional prototypes with original documentation, never commercialized, representing innovations that, in at least one case, appeared to have been independently developed by another company in Europe in the mid-1990s and incorporated into systems that were commercially successful. Whether Harold's prior work represented a viable prior art claim against that company's patents was a legal question she wasn't prepared to answer in one afternoon, but she wasn't dismissing it. Third, there was a rare collection of technical drawings and correspondence in the archival boxes, specifically, a complete series of hand-drafted blueprints for a specialized cargo handling system that Harold had been developing in the last years of his life. that she believed would be considered highly significant by maritime engineering historians and potentially by at least 2 museums she knew of that collected industrial innovation artifacts. What's the ballpark on the collection as a whole? I asked her. She was careful. She said she couldn't give me a number without proper appraisal. She said she could refer me to 2 different appraisers, one specializing in intellectual property and technical documentation, one specializing in industrial artifacts. Rough ballpark, I said. First instinct. What are we talking? She picked up her coffee cup, looked at it, put it down. She said, the artifact collection alone, the prototypes, the original drawings, the correspondence, I'd expect a serious appraisal to come in between $400,000 and $1.2 million, depending on the market and who wants them. The legal questions around the prior art issue are separate and I genuinely cannot estimate that. I drove back from DC with the windows down despite it being 40 degrees. I needed the air. And then I made the mistake, or maybe it wasn't a mistake, maybe it was exactly what needed to happen, of calling my mother to tell her I'd found something interesting in the basement of Warehouse 7. I'll give my mother credit for one thing, she kept her voice very calm for the first 3 minutes of that phone call. Asked clarifying questions. Didn't react to specifics. When I mentioned Harold's name, there was a pause, maybe 2 seconds, that told me everything I needed to know about whether my parents knew this basement existed. They knew. My mother said she needed to call my father and she'd call me back. She called back 40 minutes later. My father was on the line. He also sounded calm, which with my father is a warning sign. He asked me to describe what I'd found. I gave him a general summary, patent documents, some old equipment, technical drawings, without specifics. He said that was very interesting and that we should all sit down together to figure out the right thing to do with Harold's things. Harold's things, he called them. Not your things. Not the things in the warehouse. Harold's things. I told him I'd be in touch. I called Dr. Marsh the next morning and told her I needed to move fast. She connected me with an estate and property attorney in my state named Carl Okafor, who reviewed my transfer documents within 48 hours. His reading was clear, the deed transfer was for the property, land and structure, and made no exceptions for contents. In property law, fixtures and permanent installations transfer with the property unless explicitly excluded. Stored contents, as personal property, are a more complicated question, but his position was that the absence of any inventory or exclusion clause in the transfer documents strongly supported my claim. The transfer documents didn't say, the building but not anything in it. They just said the property. And here's the part that really mattered, the contents weren't listed anywhere in my parents' estate documentation as retained assets. They weren't on any inventory of personal property my parents maintained. There was a reason for that. 22 days after my call with my parents, I received a letter from Gerald Fitch's office. My parents were claiming that the transfer of Warehouse 7 was intended to cover the real property only, and that any personal property of the Calloway family discovered within, specifically, any documents, equipment, or artifacts belonging to or originating from Harold Calloway's estate, remained the property of the Calloway Family Trust. They were demanding I provide full access to the basement and all its contents pending a legal determination. They were also, Gerald's letter noted in careful language, prepared to pursue all available legal remedies if I did not comply voluntarily. I photographed Gerald's letter. I sent it to Carl. And then I sat with something that I hadn't let myself fully look at until that moment. My parents knew that basement was there. They let me take the building, this specific building, the one they were sure I'd demolish or sell for scrap without ever really looking at it, specifically because they thought the secret underneath it was safe. They'd been paying that climate control bill for 30 years. They'd deliberately buried that door behind 3 decades of accumulated junk. They'd given me the warehouse the way you give someone a wrapped box with nothing inside. Except it turned out someone had hidden something very real in the lining. Here's where it got genuinely serious. Carl Okafor, as he was reviewing the situation, asked me a question I hadn't thought to ask myself. when Harold died, was there any insurance claim made on his estate's assets? Specifically his business-related assets, equipment, intellectual property documentation? I didn't know. Carl said, figure it out. It took me 2 weeks, 3 calls to the insurance division of the state's Department of Financial Services, and a very useful conversation with a retired insurance adjuster who agreed to look at some records informally. What they found, in a claim filed in 1991, was that my father had submitted a claim under Harold's business property insurance policy for a category listed as research and development assets, including prototype equipment, technical documentation, and proprietary drawings, valued at approximately $180,000 in 1991 dollars. The claims stated these assets had been lost or destroyed during the liquidation and transfer of Harold's business operations. The claim was paid. My father had filed an insurance claim for assets that were sitting, perfectly preserved, in a climate-controlled basement he knew existed, in a building he'd continued to pay utility costs on for 30 years. I sat with that information for 3 days before I told Carl. Carl sat with it for about 30 seconds before he said, Sam, I need to be very direct with you. What you're describing, if documented and substantiated, is insurance fraud. That is a separate matter from your civil dispute over the contents of the warehouse, and I am not a criminal attorney. But you need to understand what you're holding before you decide how to proceed. What I was holding was a 30-year-old fraudulent insurance claim that my parents had apparently assumed was safely buried in a basement in a building they were certain I'd never properly inspect. What they were holding was a lawsuit against me for a collection they had already declared lost and collected on. If they pursued that lawsuit, if they tried to claim in a civil court that the contents of that basement were rightfully theirs, they would, by legal necessity, be arguing that those items existed and were theirs. Which directly contradicted a sworn insurance claim stating those same items had been lost or destroyed. Carl explained my options carefully and without dramatics. I could retain the contents on the basis of the transfer documents and wait for them to sue. I could report the insurance fraud separately. I could attempt a negotiated settlement using the fraud issue as leverage. Or I could do a combination. I asked Carl which option he thought was cleanest. He said, write a letter. Let them know, very politely, that you've had the collection appraised, that you've been reviewing the historical records of Harold's estate, and that you'd prefer to resolve this without involving additional parties. Leave it implicit. See what they do. The letter went out on a Tuesday. My mother called me on Thursday. My father didn't call. He let my mother make that call, which told me everything about how the ground had shifted. She was still careful. Still calm. But the quality of it was different. This was the calm of someone managing a situation they knew had gotten away from them. She said they'd been speaking with Gerald, and that perhaps there had been some misunderstanding about the nature of the transfer, and that they wanted me to know they were very proud of how I'd handled the property, and that they didn't want there to be any conflict. I told her I didn't want any conflict either. I told her I'd had everything appraised and documented. I told her I was planning to donate a portion of Harold's technical drawings and correspondence to a maritime history museum, specifically, with a full attribution to Harold Calloway as the inventor, which would generate press coverage, because these things do. I told her the prototype machines were going to an auction house that specialized in industrial innovation artifacts. And I told her that I had a meeting scheduled with Dr. Marsh next week to discuss the prior art question regarding the European patents. There was a very long silence. Then my mother said, "That sounds like you've really found your path with this, Sam." That was it. No lawsuit. Gerald Fitch's letter was never followed up on. The claim that the transfer only covered the building and not the contents was quietly abandoned. Harold's collection went to auction 8 months ago. The prototypes, drawings, and documentation sold for $870,000. The prior art legal question is still being evaluated and I'm not going to discuss it further on camera, my attorneys would prefer I didn't. But I'll tell you this. I'm not sleeping in a camp chair in a rusted warehouse anymore. And my parents don't bring up what Sam's going to do with his life at family dinners. Some doors, when you finally open them, change everything behind them. My grandfather knew I'd find it eventually. I have to believe that. Because someone decided to keep paying that bill for 30 years. And it wasn't my father. Harold Calloway left me the warehouse. And everything underneath it. And I think he always meant to. Thanks for watching. If this story hit you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you haven't subscribed yet, you already know which side you're choosing.